are now headed to political oblivion.
Breaking news.
A reporter must be able to think clearly. This sucks.
Exactly.
Welcome to Breaking News. My name is Spencer Snyder. I have a few things I want to talk to you about today. A really interesting new study about digital redlining in Philadelphia. But first, I thought I'd read a little bit from the one and only Bret Stephens. You know, if you're ever feeling like maybe you're being a little too harsh or too critical of the mainstream press, or maybe you just read a really good report from the New York Times and you've forgotten just how many people who work in the media should be just digging ditches somewhere, and not even toward a specific end, just digging holes for the sake of it because idle hands write op-eds. And so we have a little Bret Stephens here with Gail Collins having just a little chat about student loans, and they have some takes. Hi Gail, depending on whom you ask, Joe Biden's decision to forgive hundreds of billions of dollars in student loans is either the Democrats' political masterstroke or a major political gift to Republicans. What's your take? Well, Bret, allow me to take the middle road. Gee, I really do enjoy saying that. Makes me feel so judicious. God, these are the most uninspired people and they're writing for the biggest paper in the world. Can you think of something more banal than just reflexively asking, before anything else, if a piece of policy is good for Democrats or if it's a gift to Republicans? I wonder, this just seems to me like yet another case of Democrats getting on the wrong side of working class America. Most Americans don't have a bachelor's degree, sometimes because they couldn't afford it. Most Americans who did go to college either have paid their loans off or are paying them off. Now they've been turned into chumps for living within their means, while paying, through their taxes, for those who didn't. I mean, the joke about right-wingers referring to the liberal media has always been that there is no liberal media. Because these are right-wing ideas. Because first, they map this false elitism onto people who went to college by saying, well, not everyone went to college, which is, ironically, coming from someone as credentialed as Bret Stephens, to then say, Democrats are on the wrong side of working class America because most Americans don't have a bachelor's degree. A lot of the working class have college degrees, and most people with degrees are the working class. People even have student debt from degrees they couldn't afford to finish, and it's just totally untrue that anyone who's drowning in student debt or is struggling to pay student debt, it's because they're refusing to live within their means. That's absurd. And also, what's the argument here? A piece of policy doesn't affect enough people, so it's trash. It's like saying, well, I don't know if universal pre-K is a winner because most people aren't even in pre-K. And this absurd idea that someone escaping debt is an insult to those who paid, gee, I wonder if this brought relief to anybody. That might be the question worth examining. I wonder if this made anyone's life easier. Policy-wise, I just wish it had been tied to some serious reforms of the current system that helped create all that debt in the first place. Agree. One-time student loan forgiveness isn't going to get educational costs under control. If anything, it will create a moral hazard in which people take out student loans they may not be able to afford in the expectation of future loan forgiveness. How is this not the kind of conversation you'd expect to hear from your uncles at Thanksgiving? Just people who are older and well off, just assuming the population's natural irresponsibility because maybe it's just been so long since the last time they felt the anxiety of not being able to pay a bill. Or maybe they've never felt that anxiety. But it's wild to me, the contempt in suggesting that people would be so encouraged by this policy that they're going to rush to rack up debt with the expectation that it would be forgiven. First and foremost, a deep dive into for-profit schools. Many of them are total scams, and even the ones that aren't often charge more for programs people can get elsewhere. I'd add that there are plenty of nonprofit schools also charging way too much for dubious degrees. After that, a serious look at overall price tags. The fact that loans are so easy to get has encouraged even very fine schools to charge too high tuition in order to get money for programs that feed the ego of the administration more than the quality of the education. The thing that makes colleges a scam is the money. The needless requirements that you have to you have to take and pay for, even if they have nothing to do with your major. The fact that an adjunct professor who's barely scraping by is going to assign you and your classmates a chapter of a book to read, and somehow the college gets to extract thousands of dollars per student for that, that's the scam. And that's happening at every college and for every major. You can go to school and pay $10 or $30 or $50,000 a year for a degree in literature or business or music. And I don't know which degrees they're talking about when they say dubious degrees, or when Bret Stephens says dubious degrees. I would assume anything that doesn't have a more likely financial payoff, except he probably wouldn't say that because he doesn't want to sound like a Philistine. Longer term, we should help steer teenagers away from the idea that four-year college is their one and only ticket to prosperity, status, and success. We should shift our funding toward community colleges, vocational schools, and a wide range of adult education programs. I'm also sympathetic to the idea of expanding opportunities for shorter enlistment times for young people who want to join any branch of the armed forces. It could help fund their future education, and it would make them more disciplined students when they do. While we're being hard-nosed about what we want students to get out of college, I feel obliged to point out that some of the less practical aspects of higher education can be a terrific experience. Gee, I wonder if Bret Stephens is telling his kids, hey, you don't have to go to college, you join the army for a couple years, learn some discipline. I would guess not. Also, it's not until the very end of this inane, bogus conversation that someone suggests, hey, maybe college isn't only for getting a job at the end of it. Maybe it's like a sign of a prosperous and privileged society that you can go and learn and study and connect with people with similar interests and motivation, and that there is some intrinsic good in affording everyone, the ability to go to a four-year college, to go to a good college and just enrich themselves and engage with art or history or literature on a very deep level, even if it doesn't lead to a job or a super high-paying job. Moving on to more media horror, digital redlining in Philadelphia. Digital redlining is when urban areas are excluded from high-speed internet, be it by high costs, insufficient infrastructure, or slow speeds. That's digital redlining, and in a new study by Pavel Papil and Victor Picard, they look at the way different communities in Philadelphia are served and how they dealt with the pandemic when suddenly everything had to be done remotely. All of a sudden, everyone in your house had to be able to do video calls all day long and maybe at the same time. Your internet speed suddenly became pretty important, right? And whether or not it was sufficient. They mention one neighborhood, Allegheny West, which actually averages an internet speed that falls below what the FCC even considers broadband, and that's in a major city. In addition to being the headquarters of Comcast, the nation's largest broadband provider, Philadelphia was also one of the country's early experimenters with municipal broadband. In 2004, the city launched the Wireless Philadelphia project to construct the largest municipal Wi-Fi grid in the US, especially designed to connect low-income residents. However, when Earthlink, the company that won the bid to build and run the network, pulled out of the project, Wireless Philadelphia collapsed. The initiative's failure served as convenient ammunition for private providers like Verizon to lobby the Pennsylvania state legislature to eventually pass HB 30. This law significantly restricts municipal broadband projects in the state by preventing municipalities from providing broadband if the community is already served by a private provider, or if one agrees to build infrastructure in an unserved area after being requested to do so. Similar legal barriers exist in 18 other states, ensuring that public broadband options remain off the table for many communities. So what does this mean? Well, if you live in Texas, or Florida, or Pennsylvania, or any of the other states in red, if you have service and it sucks, and it's underserving your community or parts of your community, and your city or town wants to install public broadband, they can't, or it's practically impossible. It sounds like if a company so much as agrees to set up infrastructure, at least if they're asked, public broadband is now off the table. And in a time when everything one does is online. Not only should there be public broadband, there should be a guaranteed internet. I mean, imagine looking for a job without sufficient internet in your home, or having to go to the library to use their internet and deal with their hours of operation. But you actually have internet service providers lobbying to make sure public broadband is impossible. Our case study finds that Philadelphia's pandemic digital inclusion efforts face challenging logistics, limited data on the unconnected, funding concerns, and pushback from providers. Pandemic inclusion efforts by the municipal government, the school district, community anchor organizations, and private providers like Comcast prioritized access and cost over broadband speeds. Our interviewees stated that Comcast was an essential partner in the municipal government's connectivity strategy. Yet private sector low-income internet plans like Comcast Internet Essentials were too slow to support pandemic-era necessities like remote learning. Comcast did not increase the internet speeds of these low-cost plans to support a range of pandemic-related broadband needs until a year into the crisis, after significant pressure from local activist groups. And why would you expect anything different? Because when you have private companies responsible for providing necessities, you invariably run into the situation of having people who can't afford your service, but need it anyway. The internet should be free, and no company, like Comcast, should be able to hold your Zoom calls hostage. A newspaper called the Richmond Standard. They have lots of great community-oriented content, updates about the community college, local health advisories, information on where to get free school supplies, Stephen Donziger's fraud against Chevron, just regular community stuff. That last one was a little weird, but I'm gonna get to that. See, local news is dead. There are counties in this country that don't have any newspapers. These places in red, these are places that presumably, if you want to learn about your city council, you have to go to City Hall and sit in on meetings, I guess, because they don't have a newspaper at all. You have places in this country where a single reporter might be covering school board, businesses, elections, basically one-person newsrooms. Stephen Waldman estimates that to fill all the gaps in local reporting, the U.S. needs to add 50,000 new reporters. Now, all this to say that there is a void to fill, and the Richmond Standard is attempting to take up space in it. They put out community-oriented stuff. The website looks fine, and their pieces get shared. They have 40,000 followers on Facebook, and their posts have legitimate engagement. Now, an interesting thing about Richmond, California, there happens to be a huge oil refinery there, and it's run by Chevron. The refinery processes nearly 250,000 barrels of crude oil each day. When it flares, as it did more often in 2018 than in any other year over the past decade, dark smoke spirals up and across town in the Bay Breeze. When it explodes, like it did in 1989, 1999, and 2012, the thick cloud is visible across the bay and beyond, a blot against the sky that ascends before falling and settling on everything within a multi-mile vicinity that is not covered, closed, or sealed up. Needless to say, the refinery isn't too popular with local activists. Now, separate from that, what I mentioned before about local coverage, Chevron is sensitive to that, which is why they fund the Richmond Standard. Chevron took it upon itself to launch the site after hearing laments from local nonprofits that they didn't have an outlet for Richmond news. And that reasoning makes sense, because as many people know, and as I just explained, many communities are quite underserved. Now, interestingly, as far as the US is concerned, Richmond is not in terrible need of another newspaper compared to many other places. On this map, again, areas in red have no newspapers. Areas in yellow have one newspaper. The county Richmond is in actually has 6, according to this map. Obviously, there are places not too far away that don't have any newspapers, but you can probably bet that those counties also don't have Chevron refineries that explode every 10 to 13 years. So what would be the point in waging a goodwill campaign in communities you're not even directly polluting? Makes no sense. Now, Chevron makes no attempt to conceal the fact that they fund this outlet. On Facebook posts, it's written, sponsored by Chevron, and clearly stated on the website, it's funded by Chevron. I might wonder if it works in their favor, actually. It's not just a disclosure, but maybe even a branding effort. When they donate money to vandalize schools and teachers in need, that's part of a greater goodwill campaign. And if you have people who are convinced by these efforts of Chevron, maybe seeing constantly that this outlet that you believe in is the product of Chevron funding, maybe that reinforces their charity for you, because there are people who like and share these articles. And yeah, you have people, who know it's all bullshit. How generous. Maybe they should pay their taxes too. But look, they don't have to convince everybody. Transparency or no transparency, Chevron is pretending to be a local news company. Their news websites are designed to look like real news websites. The Facebook pages are labeled news. The PR professionals writing the articles call themselves reporters. This is deception. No amount of disclosure will change that. And the Richmond Standard sure does publish naked propaganda. You have the hit piece against human rights lawyer Stephen Donziger I mentioned earlier. If you don't know who he is, he won a $9.5 billion settlement against Chevron for pollution in the Ecuadorian Amazon. How about a community guide to understanding refinery flares? Yeah, I understand them. The places that do them should be shut down. And that's really all you need to understand. In this same piece from Heated by Emily Atkin, she touches on Permian Proud, another Chevron-funded local newspaper located in Texas for the people of the Permian Basin, which, as you probably guessed, is full of oil. Permian Proud recently published an article about how Chevron broke ground on a new solar project and lowered the company's carbon intensity. Carbon intensity is a meaningless bullshit term. Let me also add that I went looking for mentions of this on cable news, and I didn't find any. Brian Stelter, who was just let go from CNN, he had a show that was meant to examine the press. Obviously, the idea of a media criticism show ensconced in a corporate media network is absurd. But I went looking for mentions anyway of this because it should be offensive to anyone who believes in the press as a critical institution. Chevron funding a newspaper with the purpose of using it as a vehicle for goodwill, and I didn't find any mention of it. If it is there wasn't much of it. Now, I'm going to make the same observation I've made in the past regarding how little time Stephen Donziger's gotten on cable news, which is to say, very little, almost none, and pretty much all of it has been within the last year or so. Chevron is a big advertiser. Now, is that why certain Chevron stories get ignored? Is it why they aren't talked about even more than they are? And they do get talked about. It's not like you have people on TV praising them routinely. If Chevron's talked about, they're usually talked about negatively. But despite that, we know that there are huge stories that totally get ignored. We can't know what kind of pressure anchors and producers feel to curb negative coverage of advertisers, what kind of executive directives they get, and if you're a producer at a cable news network, you're probably focused on whatever dumb horse race things everyone has to have a take on. Maybe you just don't think Chevron buying up or starting tiny newspapers in underserved communities is an important story. And if you're employed as a cable news producer, it's probably because you suck and have a weird idea of what news even is. But this involvement in local press seems to be one of the more insidious ways oil companies have dug their claws into the media, because obviously they've been advertisers forever. Then there's the advertorials and branded content that is essentially an advertisement made to look as much like an actual piece of news content as they can get away with. And then there's this, where they target a community in which they need to manufacture goodwill, fund a news outlet there, and all the charitable scraps they flick off the table gets written about favorably. They lace it with company talking points, and it's just another thing in Chevron's PR arsenal that people who don't want to see the earth burn will have to fight against. Heated.world to read the full article. Emily Atkin, really solid stuff. But with that, I think I'll leave it there. You can follow me on Twitter or at my own channel where I explore lots of different topics. Just type my name into YouTube. If you like this content, please support Status Coup's investigative and on-the-ground reporting for as low as $5 a month statuscoup.com/join. A small percentage of people subscribe, so if you are able to be one of those people, it would go a long way to keeping this whole thing going. And I will see you in the next one.
You're now headed to political oblivion.
Breaking news.
Reporter must be able to think clearly. This sucks.
Exactly.